Hi, I'm Bungalow Bill, and welcome back to From the Depths. You may notice that I never really get my vehicles lined up. It's because when they're out of play, they have to line up on certain grid nodes, and I can't really get them to line up properly. You can do it using tractor beams, but then you have to have another structure anyway. Anyway, the topic of this video is my Ruler of Steel playthrough. It's going to be a retrospective, more of a middle-spective, because I'm going to be reattempting it with slightly tweaked rules and strategies, as well as new and rebuilt vehicles. So this will sort of be a two-part video. One will be going over a high-level issue, I'll be keeping that really brief, and the other will be going into the difficulties with each vehicle, what worked well and what didn't. So first off, I probably would have completed the campaign successfully if I didn't unintentionally anger the Trinity Republic. Likely during a battle with the Nomadic Brigade, one of my vehicles just happened to wind up in Trinity Republic territory after the battle, trespassed briefly, ruined my relationship by a minuscule amount, made them go full nuclear Gandhi on me because they had no one else, and it was a huge problem. It's possible it was salvageable, but it was not fun to play. I was just under such constant siege, and I didn't know that the issue where when you're in a map and your vehicles are being blockaded, there's a countdown. At one point in time, that countdown would keep counting down if your game was paused. Apparently that's been resolved. I did not realize that until the end of the episode, so I could have paused the game and done all of my strategic decisions. Even if that bug was still there, I would have been better off pausing, because eventually I could have cleared all of the blockades and given my orders, or just never got into that bad situation to begin with if I was very diligent about pausing. It is hard though, because the enemies like to move at 100 plus meters per second, so they really come at you out of nowhere on 3 different fronts. Besides that, the restriction I placed on myself that hurt the most was I didn't have a logistics vehicle. In particular, I usually have logistics vehicles of multiple varieties. I have ones that can repair, ones that can move large amounts of materials, and ones that can mine. The ones that can mine are useful because you can start mining resource zones before you have build access to them. In this campaign, that is useful because you get a very rich resource zone nearby that you have to slowly capture. So if I could just get that a few minutes earlier, it's actually kind of a big deal. So this time around, I will have vehicles that fill all of those roles. I may only do it with 2 vehicles though. One that carries resources and repairs, and the other one that mines. Anyway, the remaining thing was, this is a land campaign, so I built a lot of land vehicles, and, well, land vehicles are kind of bad. There are advantages and disadvantages to land vehicles. So one of the biggest disadvantages is these wheels just are not that fast. Their top speed of 60 meters per second, it's not very good in terms of From the Depths vehicles. It's better than a lot of ships, unless you make hydroplanes or stuff like that. But often you can't really get to that top speed. With bigger land vehicles you can, but with smaller ones it's quite hard. So the reason this vehicle can't is, well, one, the amount of drag that you have is proportionally much higher for a smaller vehicle. The frontal area of this, just proportional to the actual size of the vehicle, is much, much larger than some of these other vehicles, especially with the sub-objects not counting. Some of these don't have much frontal area, so it's easier to get them quite a bit faster. The other thing is that high drag, combined with a relatively high profile, because I have to build in units of 1 meter, and it's pretty hard to build a vehicle that's less than 3 meters tall with an additional 1 meter under it, means these things are pretty high center of gravities, so this thing really wants to pop a wheelie. The Recon, which goes a little bit faster, actually has this thruster to provide a counter torque. So if I go ahead, send it over here, it's going to try to pop a wheelie a little bit and try to roll over a lot. So leaning back, rolling back and forth. I had to tune it down a little bit so that it looks very, very well behaved on flat ground, but it needs to not flip over on these hills either, so I have to be pretty conservative. The other thing is, it is not going in a straight line, and that's because on-land pathfinding is not good. all the waypoints get snapped to a grid, and that grid is 10 meters in size. Well, actually, it can be significantly larger than that. If we look at the mech, look into the adjustments, its turning circle is set to the minimum 20 meters. That means that, one, it assumes it can turn really tightly, but two, it uses a very small pathfinding grid. You know, I could set this, and the pathfinding grid would be enormous. In some ways, that fixes things a little bit. In some ways, it causes its own problems sometimes. So it looks like things are going to be better when I did that, but in reality, I don't know, it's not that different. So for the mech, this isn't actually that much of a problem one way or the other. Like, there has to be a bug in this pathfinding. There really has to be. I know they've never said anything about it. I don't think that there are open bugs on it. There's no way there's not a bug on it, or that this isn't buggy. But, so for the mech, it's not a huge problem. It snakes back and forth and makes it a little bit harder to hit, but unfortunately it opens shots up to side armor, which for the mech, again, doesn't matter. For these guys, it very much matters. These have a lot of frontal armor and almost no side armor. They're front-siders. And so are the tanks. And both of these suffered from the same problem a lot in the campaign, that they would open up their side armor, take a big shot through it, and they would die. And they would die without their armor really ever being defeated. So I can fix that. I can give them on-air pathfinding. It'll behave a lot better, but they can also drive into the water, and I didn't want to have to micromanage them, so I gave them on land. In practice, you should give them on-air pathfinding and just micromanage them. So the other thing about these vehicles, just in aggregate, that made them not work to the extent that I'm not going to be recycling these, is that you just don't have to build this small. It's a volume-limited campaign, so I thought they'd start you with very small amounts of resources, which would be really fun. But no, you start out with quite a few resources so that you can make a few big vehicles. So you might as well make a few big vehicles. There's no reason to build a vehicle under, 50k. I thought it rolled over. Yeah, that's some interesting pathfinding. Anyway, there's no real reason to build a vehicle much under 50k. The fighter I'm going to be using going forward still is going to be cheaper than that, but I don't think anything else that I build is going to be cheaper. So this anti-air, I'm going to build a heavier duty version of it. This tank, I'm not going to use any tank this light. I'm going to make a heavy duty version of it as well. Although I'm going to be repurposing the medium tank, so that'll mostly fill that role. I do want I want at least 2 different types of cannons for vehicles that fill that role though, so I will be making another one. This one as well. I thought that it was intended for you to just not have lambs access at all, so I didn't use lambs. Apparently it is intended after a mission that hasn't been implemented, so I'm just going to use lambs. Lambs are incredibly powerful, and because 3 times damage multiplier with shells not having additional health, lambs are just so good that if your enemies use lambs and you don't, you're at a massive disadvantage. I did have some issues at times against the Trinity Republic when I was massively overwhelmed in force counts and I didn't have a functioning medium tank or something with very high velocity kinetic shells, because they have so many lambs and they have so much more material than me that they could just destroy all of my munitions and I couldn't really do anything about it. Having lambs to sort of equalize the playing field is going to make a huge difference. So that's all I really have to say about these vehicles. I thought they actually performed well for their size and their cost in their roles. They generally did what I needed them to do, but there's no reason to have them. They're slow. The advantage of a small vehicle is that it's fast and hard to hit. There's no reason to build a small slow vehicle. So wheels, their only real advantage being that I could put this thing on 4 wheels, and those wheels could carry an arbitrary amount of weight. You know, you could balance the land shark on 2 wheels and just have it propelled forward and back with something else, a series of jets or something, and carry the weight for free. So there are some advantages to wheels, but these vehicles are not exercising them, and these are going to just be, they're going to be trash canned. So I'll show all the other vehicles and go into more detail about them and some potential plans for them. A lot of them are going to be trash canned too. Next we have the fighter at home. This is actually one of my favorite vehicles, and it might not look so from what you saw in videos, but it's actually very effective. The enemy fighters, especially from the Union ground forces, could not successfully engage this craft. It's too fast and too small. 357 volume, it is a very small fighter. I think this doesn't have a... actually, this is roughly the right top speed, 170 meters per second. About as fast as you can get a fighter going without using exploits. It's absolutely bristling with armament too, and these missiles are actually quite good at downing enemy vehicles. Of course, the highly visible downside to it is that it outruns its own missiles, and, well, you've seen the results. So, it far too often shoots itself down. I didn't want airships, I wanted planes. I want 2 Coyotes to be exact, because they're actually somewhat fighters, unlike many of the other enemy vehicles. Okay, that's sickening. So, it launches its missiles off, and they don't detach from it very well. These missiles barely go faster than it, and despite having full thrust at launch, don't take right off. They sort of float right by it, and then has a tendency to bop into them and explode. It doesn't always do this. It looks like it's going to do it right now. And the percentage where it happens is little enough that I decided, you know what, we'll just field it anyway. It fights enemy vehicles at such a large resource advantage that it's worth it. So that was an example of what can go wrong. Let's spawn it back in and watch it again. So when it doesn't just destroy itself, the enemy vehicles, they just can't hit it. The Union ground forces fighters are pretty incapable of destroying it. It's small, it's fast. There's no way their missiles are getting on target. They're having trouble even getting their APS to bear. This thing is just very hard to deal with. So I'm a huge fan of it. It reminds me a little bit of the Millennium Falcon flying around in Star Wars. It pretty reliably fights almost any number of Union ground forces air vehicles as long as it doesn't destroy itself. Unfortunately, the more of these I have in a fleet, the higher chance they have of not only destroying themselves, but each other. I'm going to somewhat mitigate this, but I think I'm probably going to reuse this vehicle with reverse launching missiles. I did talk about it. I thought it probably wasn't necessary, and realistically it probably wasn't, but it'll make things a lot easier. There's a few ways that I can solve this missile problem. So one is to reverse launch them. This means that unlike where this fires them on the way in, it's going to get right up to the enemy, turn around, and then drop them off the back. Unfortunately, that's the most reliable way to fire missiles in from the depths. I like the concept of firing them forwards because planes in real life do that, and it should work in from the depths, but missiles kind of suck in a lot of ways, so it doesn't. Another thing is I can use ejectors. I can't use them with the rail gantries, but with the normal gantries I could. This plane simply doesn't have room for ejectors, and I'd have to make it too big and it would lose its viability. So I actually consider this a really successful plane. With the low cost of 30,000 materials, and if it doesn't destroy itself, it easily just took out 140,000 materials there and didn't break a sweat, and I could have spawned in more and it still would have won. So even if it looked like I struggled with the Union ground forces at times, those losses were often self-inflicted, and there were a very, very small percentage of the enemy losses. So I will be using this moving forwards, likely with some tweaks. I may also field it off of an air carrier instead, and use that for some fleet management, because I found it a pain in the butt to build all of these, to distribute them properly before the battle, so they wouldn't collide with each other, that sort of thing. So maybe some air vehicle that holds like 2 or 3 of these, recalls them after battle, repairs them up, handles all that fleet management stuff, so I don't have to. But otherwise, I was very happy with this vehicle. Alright, let's take a look at the only other vehicle that I was very happy with. So this is probably the only one that I'm not going to be changing at all. It looks simple. The concept is fairly simple, but it's built fairly well, and it serves a very important niche in the Ruler of Steel meta, which is why it's pretty important. Given that it's using small missiles, this is actually it's a decent amount of firepower. So, as you've probably seen, it shoots an absolute hail of small missiles to overwhelm enemy missile defenses, because the enemies use a lot of missile interceptors, and at 3 times damage, it's hard to deal with. This provides important utility for my other missile-based vehicles to actually get damage through. Not that I have that many, but I may have more going forwards. Also, it suppresses enemy missile fire, which is very useful, and is good at removing enemy detection or just straight up AI deading many enemies. Also, it's moderately redundant as long as it doesn't lose both thrusters on either side, so you can put a hole through this in most places and it'll keep flying. The ammo doesn't chain detonate as well, which gives it moderate tankiness and survivability. So we'll spawn it against something that's not good to fight aircraft against. Is actually why I spawned 2 of these. So the Black Mamba. The Black Mamba is pretty scary. It's got missiles, it's got missile interceptors, it's got a gun that is very spicy. However, when you're getting resurfaced, you have trouble aiming sometimes. So the bombers like to hover just overhead, they like to remove enemy detection. They are not as easy to shoot down as you might expect. Actually, one-on-one these might beat the Black Mamba pretty easily as well. Part of the reason I spawned in with the Black Mamba is somebody said in the comments that it's very spicy, and I did actually destroy a lot of them in the campaign. Mostly with bombers, they tend to make very short work of the Black Mamba, even when they're not fighting it at material parity. 2 bombers cost the same as a Black Mamba. They do take a little bit of time to kill it, but they have a high... Okay, it still has the APS firepower. I was going to say they have a high preference for enemies that actually have firepower, so they will move on. One of the big downsides is these missiles are radar designators. If I do rebuild the bomber at all, it's going to be to use remote guided missiles. And there's the AI dead, with the intention of them being able to be more selective about targets. A difficulty that I had fighting the Union ground forces base was that my bombers that should have been able to kill their anti-air turrets were instead trying to kill the 500,000 material base. Instead, that didn't need to die. It was the turrets that needed to die. So I'm likely not going to tweak them either way. I'll likely have other missile vehicles capable of bombarding bases like that. And these will stay the way that they are because they serve a very useful early game role, flattening the Pneumatic Brigade as well as the Union ground forces and the Allied forces. Here we're getting further down in the tier list. You know, if we're to give this a letter grade, it's probably closer to the B or the C's. And unfortunately we've gotten there rather quickly. And it's pretty much been all air vehicles that have been at the high tiers because mobility is very important in this campaign. Please stop that, I'm getting sick, and you probably are too. So, I already showed this vehicle off, as I did most of these. I did a showcase for it, but I'm already underway for building another variant of this, so I'll say what I'm changing. This thing is a pack fighter. It could be faster and more maneuverable. It's actually slower than the bomber. Moderately, but not that high particle cannon firepower. The main thing for me is this thing is too big. It's closer in size to many of the enemy aircraft, and that means I can hit the enemy aircraft, well, they can hit me too. If this thing was faster and more maneuverable, it would do better, but 900 volume, that's at a bad middle ground. I don't think this thing is that poorly built, other than the fact that it could use more thrust, but simply, it's just not in a good place meta-wise. It's big enough to hit, but it's not big enough to be survivable. If this thing was bigger and packing lambs, and flew stably and just shot down enemy missiles, might be better, might be a much better situation. But awkward stepchild, just not in a great spot. So it's still not a bad craft. It's just, it doesn't do as well as I need it to. Also, I think I shot a lot of these down. I don't think it was just the enemies shooting these down, although they certainly can. Another thing is my fighters tend to not do as well in chaotic dogfights with 10 plus craft on each side. So we took a hit there, it wasn't that much though. We shot a wing off. We'll try to recharge and fire another shot. We're also not good at sitting on the tail of enemy vehicles. It's because I didn't tune Eigenfunction's breadboard well enough. I'm just gonna make my own breadboard. Double miss. So, do I have repair tentacles on? Well, no I don't. So, we've taken a few small missiles, which is better than not being able to take them, but we can't take any serious hits. That enemy is looking increasingly dead in the air. We did not fire our EMP pack there either. We might be having some maneuverability issues. No, we're not. I thought we were going to collide though. So, this is actually a much poorer showing than this thing usually makes. It can often one-shot enemy flyers like the Coyote, but isn't quite managing it this time around. I'll probably cut it short here. It's just, I did not say how I was going to be improving it. So I'm building a much smaller, much faster version of it. It's going to be closer to the fighter at home in terms of size. And it's going to be operating off of a carrier that provides the juice for it. So this thing just can't fill its batteries anymore. That's why it can't fire. Let's watch it take another shot. So this thing needs to have its own engine and fill its own batteries, and that's a lot of weight, and that's a lot of size. The updated version of it that I'm going to build is just going to feed off of a carrier. And that provides a lot of evasion and maneuverability advantages. Okay, finally hit with the EMP. That's certain death for most aircraft because it's very hard to actually put EMP protection in these, at least enough to stop an EMP pack. Moving further down in the tier list, although this might be above the fighter, is the medium tank. The medium tank is actually a very nasty ground force. This APS cannon really stings, and it's not that expensive. It falls very much in line with enemy main battle tanks, except a little bit cheaper. Its issue is its speed. I think I replaced the block or two. It should be about 40 meters per second. And its cannon. Its cannon can be a little bit problematic at times. So this thing shoots a very fast shell, but the difficulty that I have with it is that there's just enough terrain that a lot of the time it just can't hit the enemy. The scarier enemy tanks actually shoot like 700, 600 meter per second hash. Can just barely arc over these hills and we can't return fire. It still one-shots or does quite well against many enemy tanks. The Gepard is probably the one that it really just doesn't work against. But it suffers from a few issues due to being a land vehicle. So it has really good detection, but I noticed some issues with the gun tracking sometimes. It looks fine here though. The biggest one though is if it's not fighting on very flat terrain like this, it just can't shoot. And what'll happen is because the gun has some behavior set up just by default and from the depths where APS will try to avoid shoot. Yeah, so this is the good thing about the tank. It can put a round straight through just about any armor that you'll see in this custom campaign with a few exceptions. But, oh, I lost her barrel. That happens a lot too. But if the gun sees terrain in the way, it'll disengage and look for another target. I guess that was added in at some point. Well, what often happens with these low-lying hills is that it'll see the terrain, as far as I can tell, it sees the terrain get in the way, then doesn't, then sees it get in the way and doesn't. And you'll see the gun go bop, 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 and it's not a detection problem. I spent a lot of time triaging that. It's actually seems to be a line of sight problem on the tank causing those issues. The only way that I can think of to fix this is either lower velocity shells or to make this a hover tank. I'm going to go with the hover tank option. And another reason for it is that the enemy tanks are suspiciously good at hitting my barrel. I don't know why they're so good at it, but they almost always hit the barrel. And lop it very early. If I turn this into a hover tank and extend the nose very slightly, and give myself decent depression on my mantlet, my barrel will be sticking like this, where its hitbox is, but it'll be aiming down like this, and the enemies will be shooting up a bit. It'll be really hard for them to actually snip the barrel the way that they have been. It's going to require some rebuilding. So this thing does not have an armored underbelly. I probably still won't rebuild it that way and have it just fly low enough that tanks mostly head on. There are also some mild weaknesses in the armor. Wedges have their advantages and disadvantages for being a bit cheaper and providing some mitigation against armor-piercing shells, but forwards wedges like this on a relatively small vehicle do have problems, and I might be replacing all of these with beam slopes, because this is significantly harder to knock through than these wedges. So, I'm still overall very happy with this. I think it's a very strong tank, but a very strong tank just isn't what I need, especially with the issues this one has with terrain. So, this will be getting upgraded into a hover tank, and hopefully that will serve me better. Alright, now we're seeing a sort of middle-of-the-pack, acceptable vehicle, but unexciting. This is the battle copter. I'd grade it somewhere around a C, probably. It's aerial, so it doesn't suffer many of the disadvantages of the other vehicles, but it's large, which means that the enemy vehicles like to target it, and it's less armored than my other vehicles, which is actually a really bad place to be, along with a mediocre top speed. All of that together, this thing doesn't have the utility that it needs to keep up with the faster enemy vehicles, and it has questionable side armor and defenses, so when the enemies are fielding 10 vehicles at a time, this can often be a liability as it'll be swarmed and then taken down very quickly. It does pack a lot of destructive power though. This cannon is very much worth bringing to fights. It is often quite devastating, and I tested this thing out a little bit, and as sort of awkward and vulnerable as it looks, it generally performs quite well in 1v1 engagements. Unfortunately, something I noticed earlier was that I did not resave this. I actually modified this before playing the campaign to put more thrust into the bottom so that either of these two blades can be taken down and it can keep fighting. For whatever reason, I either failed to save it or saved it in some other folder that I can't find now, and it's back to these two. It was a considerably better craft when it could fly without these, but I'm going to be discontinuing it either way. What I don't like about it, this cannon, we'll see, it's an ugly middle ground. Oh, it's very fast too. 1800 meters per second. That much I do like about it, but it's an ugly middle ground. So here, I don't have a tracer or a base bleeder. I should probably have one or the other. There's really no excuse. And these shells, out of 2-meter clips, they don't quite frontally penetrate tanks, and that causes problems. This thing would be way better if it could either penetrate tanks, or if it just shot a way sandblastier faster round that would allow it to effectively engage many more targets than it can. So it would give it more game against fighters and that sort of thing, give it better barrel rotation speed, allow it to shoot down missiles with its cannons, not put all of my eggs in one basket, so losing one barrel would cause so many issues. So obviously it's still very capable in one-on-ones. I just wasn't anticipating how big the fleet size was going to be, and it turned out to be a poor meta choice, despite being a actually very strong vehicle in its own right. So there's not much left of the Black Mamba at this point. We may have lost some of our detection, or our accuracy suffering a little bit. Oh no, there we go. No, we have very good detection actually. Well, now we have no detection. So, actually, very powerful vehicle that just... I could have made a few tweaks to make it a little bit more solid, make it look a little bit better, but really just didn't slot well. There's no niche in this campaign. That was the real problem with it. So I'm not going to be improving it. I'm more just going to be totally replacing it with a different kinetic APS variant that'll probably look way different, be way tankier, survive much better in these chaotic engagements. At this point, we're starting to get to the abject failures. This one might be more of a D, which at this school isn't enough to hold it back, I guess. So this is the Crater Maker. The Crater Maker was intentionally mildly gimped because I find a lot of enemies, especially in enemy factions for campaigns, they just don't deal with spacecraft at all, especially in Neater. So even though this one's supposed to hover overhead, so I made it a moderately small cross-section, I didn't make it minuscule. It's also not that well armored, so if the enemy can hit it, it's often a one-shot. The gun is decently armored. Everything else is horribly armored. So in a 3x damage campaign, this just doesn't stop missiles. Despite the fact that this is in space, the enemy missiles are very good at hitting this. They very rarely miss, which is why I had to put an anti-missile battery on it. There's a lot of high-speed kinetic APS with good gun elevation as well. This thing was more useful for its satellite dish than its other capabilities, although you'd often see it plinking away at targets during the campaign. And if it wasn't taking too much fire, it was destroying enemy vehicles in a quick and energy-efficient manner, although plunging fire through turret caps is less effective with plasma than it would be with APS, heat, or HESH rounds. So if I build this in the future, it would be probably more of like a helicopter instead of a spacecraft, although I might do a compact, sleek, and faster spacecraft that shoots moderate velocity heat or HESH shells. Likely, though, there just won't be an equivalent for this vehicle. We'll have to see. I still haven't made up my mind, and after I build a few more vehicles, I'll probably know one way or the other. Now we're nearing the very end of the campaign. We're getting to the vehicles that basically never did anything. This is one of my favorites, too. This is the Stealth Bomber. So I don't use a lot of decos, so a plane this small, sub 300 volume, isn't going to look fantastic, but I still think it's cute. It packs a very hefty missile. So this thing is supposed to be very small, decently fast, loiter at an incredible distance. So the whole goal about this thing is that it knows roughly where the enemy is. I don't have a one turn. It's supposed to have a one turn on it. It's supposed to turn towards the enemy, And then this laser designator aims at our team's lasers, and another vehicle, a spacecraft, will really guide it in. This isn't a very fast missile, but it has a very long thrust duration and a decent lifetime, so this can really come in from a very long distance. The whole point of this was for breaking bases and bringing very cheap firepower to bear on bases. So for things like the Union Ground Forces base that I kind of gave up on killing, well, I was actually intending to bring a squad of these things to kill it. Unfortunately, anytime that there are enemy ground vehicles, they have so many missile interceptors that I just wasn't able to get these things to work. Their missiles just weren't doing anything. Missile interceptors are so effective that even putting on a large missile, even putting a lot of reinforced bodies, barely helps anything. So I gave up on these. This is another one where if I had a carrier that would bring a lot of these to bear, I might like it quite a bit more, and I might actually use it. Managing all of these myself, because these only cost 15k, so managing all of these was such a pain that I was just over it and I stopped. If the laser designator was from the carrier and just brought these with it, I might have a different outlook on it. But my thoughts on it are still that I would rather have something more flexible that doesn't get hard countered by so many enemy vehicles. The other thing here is the counterpart to it, the Eye of Todd. So these detection things are actually on turrets, so they point at the enemy. It has exceptionally good detection. A lot of my vehicles don't, although the ones that have guns usually have good enough detection to actually hit the enemies. But this provides the whereabouts for enemy vehicles to the rest of my team, and has a laser designator that's supposed to paint targets for this. Ultimately, sort of failed idea for this campaign. If the enemies didn't spam missile defense so much, I think I would have actually put a lot of good use to these. I will likely use them, possibly with some variants, like not using the Eye of Tide, using something else to paint the targets, and maybe use them in an Ashes campaign. We'll have to see. I did like these, but they've got to get an F for usefulness in this particular campaign. Lastly, we'll look at a vehicle that I introduced and proceeded to never use. This is, I call it the Neo Tank. It's the heaviest tank that I can bring to bear. Expensive, a lot of armor, not really that much firepower. It has cram. This cram will never ever hit anything in this campaign, part of the reason I never fielded it. I love cram mortars, my god are they useless. It has a big turret full of 1 meter autoloaders that shoots Hesh at pretty low velocities. Too many of the enemy vehicles move 100 meters per second or faster. This will never hit them. Its detection is kind of questionable. I really ran out of space in this, so it could really use other vehicles to help spot for it. But it's pretty fast. If I ever did use it, it would be a nice defensive bastion for the rest of the fleet to center itself around, but it's just, it definitely wasn't in the meta. There was no way that I was actually going to use this thing, given how the enemy designs actually performed. So, absolute F, never used it. Barely even thought about using it.